important to rebuild public relations and also engage internally where there have been concerns. Spit and bite guards, however, we do have a difference of opinion in respect of your decision on the temporary extension of the use of spit and bite guards. To be clear, the board is not satisfied that the spit and bite guards offered adequate protection to your staff or officers, and the evidence, we believe, points to that. Furthermore, we have been asking you to carry out a full equality impact assessment to fully understand, identify and mitigate any adverse impacts of these guards on detainees, and to inform your decision making in this regard. The board respects the integrity and value of your operational responsibility. However, it is also not a means of insulation from the public, to which the PSNI are accountable through the policing board. You will appreciate that proper scrutiny of your actions in the democratic environment are essential parts of the checks and balances in a system under which enormous power has been entrusted to you to use for the protection and safety of the public. PSNI have been given those powers in trust, and it is entirely necessary and rational that you are properly held to account for their use by this board. Over to you, Chief Constable.
Well, thank you, Chair, for that introduction, and to members. I introduce the report today, which, as you say, has a lot of detail on a variety of subjects, and almost seeing it as a bit like an end-of-term report, given the time of year we're in. It's easy to forget we're on the cusp of Christmas. Firstly, by way of introduction, Chair, I think it's important to put on record our thanks as a team for the board support in relation to growing the headcount of the organisation, the investment in neighbourhood policing, and the development of 3 big business cases for modernisation of the future. But we are, I recognise, here at the end of a unique year with unique challenges, and there are some legitimate public concerns about a range of policing matters which I will address today. I think it's important, though, to begin recording my appreciation for the dogged determination of both officers and staff, and indeed the leadership of the organisation, in supporting the executive in the fight against this awful illness, which is obviously the first pandemic we've had to deal with in a century. I do appreciate the comments that yourself and others are making about judgments, about both policing style and how we've met the challenge of policing in a COVID environment. And absolutely, we accept we cannot get everything right. We've been at the forefront of policing a fast-moving and changing legislative environment, as well as the virus itself and all the issues that go with it, so that we recognise there's sometimes more to do. But we are reflective as an organisation. I think history shows that. We have conducted our own review this year with the Gardaí Corner to look at lessons learned in terms of what you could describe as COVID-1. We do have your report, your reference, Chair, which we are working through in a systematic way at the moment. We'll reply back to that in March. And indeed, we wait the report from the Ombudsman herself in relation to some other elements of how we policed parts of the COVID year. And I'll return to that later. It is good to welcome, as you say, colleague Lynn Owens, the Director General of the NCA, on the call today, showing the support for how they are shifting their emphasis to more high-impact operations to support the fight against serious and organised crime here. It's probably worth recognising, though, that the model in which we work here is different from the rest of the UK, tackling the breadth of serious crime, terrorism, and all that goes with it. And of course, this week, the BBC Spotlight programme has again shown things are in sharp focus. I always keep an open mind about what we've done in the past and where we can do better. And certainly myself, Mark the Depp, and Barbara as a lead on this, keep the tactical response under active review. And I'm particularly persuaded, for example, by how we look at issues that are highlighted by HMICFRS, one of our main sort of watchdog type bodies, where other places in the UK are doing well. So, for example, would the Matrix type approach in Merseyside Police, which tackles organised crime, be something we could adapt to the environment here and build on the work the Paramilitary Crime Task Force are doing? But it's easy to forget that's all we've actually embraced this year, aside from COVID, isn't it? Because we've conducted our largest single counter-terrorism operation for a decade. We've had a man sentenced to 22 years in prison for the cowardly murder of a police officer. And we've been working with the National Crime Agency, as we've heard, which has led to our largest overall haul of drugs in a year so far at £6 million. We're running our largest and most complex money laundering investigation, and the sheer scale and complexity of what some of our detectives colleagues are doing at the moment is quite remarkable. We have 250 complex investigations running, 100 centred on homicide and 120 on terrorism. We're moving to the arrest phase of our largest safeguarding operation, so the breadth and pace is relentless. It's easy to forget we're 4 weeks away from EU exit. We're still unclear the form that will take. We're doing a lot of work led by ACC Mark McEwen, and only yesterday joined a ministerial meeting with the Justice Minister here, as well as her counterpart from Dublin and senior colleagues from the Garda Síochána, looking at approaches to this issue in the weeks and months ahead. And also introduced to colleagues today the launch of our Seasons Greetings Christmas campaign. But turning back to the COVID issues you've touched on, Chair, I think there's a few bits I'd like to stress. Firstly, I want to assure all board members and indeed the public that speculation that we're running down the clock in relation to the Storey and fuel investigation is misplaced. And I have personal assurances from the prosecution service about how the time dimension will be managed within normal practice and procedure. But I do recognise that, as you allude to, the policing process has raised a number of issues which are highlighted in John's report, and we'll bring back some of our conclusions to you in January and then the February meeting. That, I suppose, some to degree is about law and due process. But I do also recognise that events across the summer have shown the depth and breadth of public emotion, which is palpable of different communities have seen at different times, frustration, concern, indeed hurt about how we've policed a variety of things, from funerals to parades to protest. So I recognise that working with yourself, it's my duty and our duty to maintain and improve public confidence. Certainly, you may have a view that some of the language we've heard in the past, that policing is perhaps no longer a two-tier game, and the Black Lives Matter protest showed us there's different issues we have to address as well. In that regard, and it's referenced in my report, I want to announce to you today my plans for next year to launch a new community relations task force, which will be led by ACC Mark McEwen. We're going to work with the board on developing the terms of reference, and I want to commit to making improving community engagement a key priority for next year. You will recall your support across the year for investing an extra 400 officers into neighbourhood policing teams, if you like, the what. So the how will be how we improve the relationship with communities, building on what we've done over years of experience. I do not underestimate, Chair, the emotion and the concern about the emotive issue and difficult issue of spit and bite guards, but I want to share some facts before I take questions. This matter has been rolling along since 2004, so 16 years, when a previous ombudsman made a recommendation we should consider their introduction, and we've been in active dialogue with the board since the 18th of March in that regard. It is fair to say it's an evolving approach, and we're learning the lessons as we're going along. But equally, we're now an outlier. We're the only police service in the UK and indeed the island of Ireland, because the Garda Síochána have introduced the same tactics, that don't have this protection available in terms of helping me manage my health and safety duties in a COVID environment, both in relation to the officers and staff and indeed the public that they come into contact with. It is worth stressing, for the avoidance of doubt, that our opinion is the spit and bite guards absolutely are a lawful tactic, and indeed it's something your previous Human Rights Advisor, Alison Kilpatrick, reminded us of in the previous report. We have tried to listen really hard. So we've seen, for example, evidence for the Independent Service Medical Panel, which is something the National Police Chiefs Council use to test the viability of different use of force tactics. And they would stress that spit and bite guards are actually a safe tactic, and they help address some of the concerns. We've carried out our own research, which will point to, for example, from the officer's point of view, of a small-scale study that shows being spat at and having spit in your face, in your mouth, in your eyes, has caused acute stress and sleeplessness. So there's an impact on officers that have to deal with this difficult issue. This has been a real-time experiment, though, so the situation and the data we have now is different to that we shared with you in March when we made our initial decisions. There's been nearly 300 spitting and biting incidents since the start of the rollout. So some may agree that, to a certain extent, some people are trying to weaponise spitting and biting in the COVID environment because of the anxiety that it causes to officers and staff. But I think sometimes the debate focuses on one end of that behaviour. A third of the incidents we're dealing with are actually bites. So face guards and helmets and other alternative means of protecting staff just won't work. The other issue is that we've taken this issue really seriously, and it is, in our view, the least difficult use of force. It's the most proportionate way of dealing with people that are sometimes extremely violent in terms of the resistance they offer officers, because mostly these spit and bite guards are used in arrest and conflict situations. So 2/3 of the deployments are in the arrest phase, and a third of those are actually on the street, which just again shows how spontaneous are some of the issues that we have to face. We've looked at independent tests to see as best we can the effects of wearing a spit and bite guard under people under stress, and from the medical evidence we've seen, there's been no deterioration in terms of, for example, things like blood oxygen saturation, which would point to any medical risks of using the kit. But we do listen. So, conscious of your comments, Chair, we've been in dialogue with the Equality Commission, the Human Rights Commission, the Children's Commissioner, and indeed the Ombudsman. And we are partway through a full equality impact assessment, which is at stage 2, and we'll bring that back to the board when we are finished. Checks and balances are at the cornerstone of what we've been doing on this issue. You are aware that we will mandate the use of body-worn video when officers apply this tactic, and sometimes a prisoner under arrest will also be filmed in a cell van, and of course as a matter of routine in the custody centre. The Deputy Mark and I have committed personally to sign off amendments to training and policy before we roll out this equipment any further. And also we rely absolutely on the checks and balances of the work of the Ombudsman, who reviews every single incident. She has told me that spit and bite guards are an important part of that check and balance that she will look at. So she's said in a public comment, the spit and bite guards are made of a mesh type fabric and are placed over an individual's head to reduce the effects should that person attempt to bite or spit at officers. The Ombudsman acknowledges the competing obligations of me, the Chief Constable, to ensure the health and safety of my staff, and the human rights obligations to ensure that spit, hoods and bite guards are used properly and proportionally with regard to dignity and the human rights of the subject. So I do rely on the Ombudsman really strongly to make sure that this tactic is used fairly and well. We've deployed it 72 times, and to date there hasn't been one public complaint. I think finally, before I take questions, Chair, it would be remiss not to acknowledge the furore about the investigation this week into the death of the late Patrick Finucane and the comments about a public inquiry. Overall, it reminds us of the difficulties of policing the past and the pain and anger and suspicion that often goes with the investigation of legacy-related deaths. It's worth reminding people that we remain the only institution in law able to investigate Northern Ireland-related crime, and this case sits within my statutory responsibility alongside other trouble-related murders. It's fair to say that previous investigations, which we can detail later, and reports satisfy us that there remain no viable lines of inquiry. We will begin the first step of a review process next week after careful consideration, but it's also worth stressing that we've made it plain that this is a very complex case, that the remedies themselves are complex and strewn with practical difficulties as outlined in our recent press release. There are also extant issues in the purview of the Ombudsman's office which have to be taken into account in any overall decision. So I think, suffice to say, Chair, I can press pause and take questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Chief Constable. Before we go into questions, Chief Constable, I'm going to ask Lynn Owens, the Director General of the NCA, just to say again a few headlines, give us a few headlines around her report. Lynn will not be staying with us throughout the entirety of the session, so some of the early questions we will direct toward Lynn and then recognise that she needs to go on. So over to you, Lynn.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm delighted to be here before the board again, a second time during COVID. I think we all hoped it would be in person this time round, so I am sorry about that. Just to echo everything Simon Berners said, we have a very good and effective operational working relationship with the Police Service of Northern Ireland. But recognised your push for time, just going to the report. The first thing I want to do is just talk to you very briefly about how serious and organised crime has changed throughout COVID. Sadly, criminals use every opportunity, including a global pandemic, to their own ends. I would describe the impact on Northern Ireland in 3 ways. The first is we know that criminals are trying to make use of all the government stimulus package to make money, which is what so many of them do serious organised crime for. And we're working very hard with partners across government to target those who are abusing the schemes. The second and perhaps most sickening area is those offenders who seek to abuse children, who know that more children are at home on their screens and are using that to make contact with them and to either blackmail them into abusing themselves or worse still, abusing others. And the report contains detail of work that we've done in that regard. And then lastly, the movement of illegal migrants, whether by boat or by lorry, still continues to be a threat to the whole of the UK, and something that we take very seriously because, as we saw through the tragic events in the Purfleet area of Essex, it does lead to death. So those are the three areas where we've seen serious and organised crime change during this period. The reports, we've provided 2 reports since I last appeared before you, which detail our continued determination to target those serious and organised criminals who are impacting on the communities of Northern Ireland. Our major and moderate disruptions are higher than they have ever been, and you'll see our minor disruptions have gone down very slightly, and that's a direct agreement between ourselves and the Police Service of Northern Ireland, where Simon has encouraged us to focus in areas where actually there are powers that his officers can use themselves. Just to highlight a couple of areas from the report. So under Operations Median, 15-year sentence handed down to organisers of a £2.8 million worth of cocaine conspiracy. We've been leading on 5 CSA child abuse investigations through which we have safeguarded 10 children in Northern Ireland. And we have worked to tackle and disrupt the firearms threat to Northern Ireland and at the border under Operations Sonema and Operations Motorflow. We do continue to focus those who seek to abuse the border and strip organised criminals of their cash and their illegally gained assets, an area that I know you at the board have asked us to focus on historically. Just as 2 examples, we see £16 million worth of cocaine destined for Northern Ireland. At Holyhead, the Northern Ireland-based lorry driver was charged and remanded, and we have obtained a recovery order by consent in respect of 7 residential apartments and 5 commercial units in the North Belfast area worth £650,000. But as well as doing that, you have access to all of the capabilities of the National Crime Agency. So the major crime investigative support capability in the last 12 months supported 63 Northern Ireland major crime investigations, including murders, serious sexual offences and suspicious child deaths. And you've also asked us to focus our civil recovery team in the work they do in Northern Ireland, as that's something that PSNI cannot do themselves. And so far in 2020, CRT have tasked 3 new civil recovery operations linked to Northern Ireland under Part 5 of the Proceeds of Crime Act, and they relate to over £5.1 million worth of assets. The total value of property frozen by the National Crime Agency in Northern Ireland is currently about £200,000. But our response to serious and organised crime in support of the board and the Police Service of Northern Ireland is not solely operationally focused, and we have done 3 significant things in this period. We've been working with the Northern Ireland DOJ alongside others to progress the commencement of the Criminal Finance Act powers in Northern Ireland. Indeed, an NCA lawyer recently provided evidence for the scrutiny panel. We continue to be involved in and contribute to the revision of the Northern Ireland Organised Crime Strategy, and we have commissioned the recently published National Assessment Centre Assessment. It's an intelligence document on the exploitation of polliers by OCGs in recognition of this specific Northern Ireland threat, which will continue to inform the operational response of ourselves and the Police Service of Northern Ireland. We are, of course, in the run-up to the exit of the UK from the EU, and alongside Simon, the partners based in Northern Ireland, the DOJ, the Northern Ireland Office and the Home Office, we have been working tirelessly, depending on whether it's a negotiated outcome or a non-negotiated outcome, to make sure that we can continue to keep all our citizens safe. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have, and I commend our report to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lynn. Appreciate that quick resume, and thank you for the good work that's ongoing, and good to know that it is a proper partnership, as you have said, and as Simon and Barbara who are with us can confirm in the room. Going to go to some direct questions to you first, and then we'll open it up to Simon's report, starting with Colm online, and then Michael in the room. So Colm first, please.
Sure, thank you, and then thank you very much for the report. Very comprehensive. You touched us towards the end of that one thing that worries us all in Northern Ireland, whether it be from a trade perspective or justice perspective, and that's the EU exit, which formalises just 4 weeks late. And I suppose I just say a little bit more. I mean, we do rely quite a bit, not just from Northern Ireland, but from a pan-UK perspective, on those relationships that we have as a UK competent authority in the European arrest warrant, for example. On many of those relationships, I suppose the question is that we will either get a deal, a negotiated settlement, or we'll end up with no deal. And even if, I suppose what I would suggest is even if we do get a negotiated settlement, it'll be a very light touch one. So it's from the perspective of the reality that's going to take place in 4 weeks' time. What assurance can you give us of trying to maintain some of those relationships, or the alternative if you can't maintain those relationships? Not sure.
Thank you very much for the question. To reassure the board, we have been working tirelessly with all partners, including the Police Service of Northern Ireland, so that the UK is prepared for either a negotiated or a non-negotiated outcome. We've been preparing in 3 broad ways. The first thing that we have been doing is producing regular intelligence updates about what we think the criminals are going to do. As I've said through the COVID update, there is no doubt that serious and organised criminals are adaptable, and they will be looking for whether it's a deal or a no-deal situation as to how they can exploit, and we need to be on top of that. So the first thing is we've been directing our intelligence assets in that area. The second, you very rightly recognise, is the importance of international partnerships. I have an outstanding a team of international liaison officers based around the world, between about 140 and 160 people based overseas at any one time, including in Dublin. And they are constantly assuring international partners that the commitment to tackle serious organised crime, which is a global phenomenon, continues to be a priority of the UK. And our operational partners also recognise the contribution, the intelligence and crime contributions they get from the UK. And then the third area is in relation to our responsibility as a competent authority and access to the tools that we will have. At this stage, we don't know which tools we are going to have available to us, but we have prepared for both scenarios. There are many, many tools that I could list, and your time probably doesn't allow me to go through them all. So I shall just list a few. So in respect of European arrest warrants, we are working with the Home Office. What will happen is we will revert to the previous legislation, which does allow for people to be circulated as wanted, and for the notification of that, the fact that they are wanted to be shared worldwide, globally, through the Interpol setup. The only issue with that alternative is it doesn't have an immediate arrest power connected to it, and we, the Home Office, recognise that and are working on fast-track legislation to fill that gap. And it has required us to convert all of those who are wanted within the UK from police forces into the national system and then out to Interpol, and I'm pleased to tell you that is up to date. It is all done. And we've also been working with international partners so they can do the reverse, so that if people try and travel here who are wanted by them, then we know. In the other tool that we rely on is for SIS2, the Schengen Information System. We don't know whether we will have access to that at this stage. That's an intelligence sharing platform. Again, the alternative to that is updated notices within Europol, and that will require frontline police officers to do a check when they stop somebody of those systems. The National Police Council has established a piece of work directly with police forces to deliver a training package to all frontline officers, so they know how to use that if that is something that we have to move to. And the other thing that's well used by partners, particularly at the border, which I understand is a great concern to you, is passenger name records. And again, we are unclear what access to that we will have at this stage. But whether we are in a negotiated or non-negotiated settlement, I am confident that from a law enforcement operational perspective, we have done everything we can within the bounds of what we currently understand to put alternative measures in place. In many instances, it's important I do say, though, they are slower than what we currently have, and they will require frontline police officers and indeed those working for me to behave differently.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Michael, you have a question for Lynn? Michael? No? No, okay. In that case, on to Mike. You have a question with regard to, it's not specifically for Lynn, sorry, you're looking at me strange there, with regard to COVID and also the potentially the Spotlight programme.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. But given my background, can I begin by condemning the attacks on journalists and the threats to journalists, rather? On Tuesday, I did a virtual event at which Alison Morris of the Irish News said there was a time when a man threatened to cut her throat within the hearing of a police officer, and the officer's reaction was to tell Alison that she needed to move on rather than arrest the man who had made the threat. So, Chief Constable, could I encourage you maybe to convene a round table with media editors so you can hear firsthand their frustrations, because their perception is that you don't take these threats seriously enough. My two questions: first of all, I'd like your assessment of the accuracy of the revelations in this week's Spotlight programme. And secondly, with regard to what the Chair called Helen's Baywatch, is it true an officer told people on the beach to wise up? And did an officer confront a man emerging from a swim in Belfast Lough to challenge him because he wasn't wearing a face mask?
Okay, thank you, Chair. A couple of bits there. Firstly, just going back to my introduction, I think Mark pointed out, I talked about the murder of a police officer. It was a prison officer, so just to correct that. So he was obviously of a keen ear. That wasn't intentional. In relation to editors, Mike, we had a meeting on Monday, I think it was, Barbara, with Ryan and Barbara to address just that concern. So if we need to speak afterwards about the threat in relation to Alison Morris, we can. I think bring Barbara in on the accuracy of the Spotlight programme and kindred reports, because there's obviously a lot of issue there. And Helen's Bay, their levels of detail, I don't actually know about comments that were made. Clearly, we had officers that went to the beach, went through the 4E's approach, and at 30, people dispersed, as in sort of encourage and explain and get them to go. So Alan is on the call. He might know specifics in relation to the face mask and someone coming out of the sea, which obviously would be a bit bizarre. But whether we want to bring Alan in, Chair, or I can just get the detail to Mike by other means.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, there's a photo of Alan. I don't know whether he's there. Alan, do you wish to comment? Yeah.
I'm happy to get the detail for Mr. Nesbitt. Just for clarity, police responded to the area not particularly because of the charity swim, but because of complaints from local residents about cars blocking roads, and it was on attendance. We looked at that complaint that were raised by a number of local residents, that they became aware of a large number of people on the beach who were not socially distanced. As I understand it, I will get the detail, there was a professional, calm conversation about people being potentially in breach of the social guidelines and indeed the gathering regulations, and people agreed to disperse. I think that makes sense. While some people may have been unhappy that the event drew that attention, I got the sense that it was a professional and responsible conversation between police officers and responsible members of the public who responded to those requests to disperse. But I'm happy to provide detail going in line.
Okay, thank you. Dolores, you have a supplementary, I'm told, on that area. Oh, sorry. Oh, Barbara, I beg your pardon. Just before you come in, Dolores, Barbara first. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The Spotlight programme this week referenced very clearly the harm that paramilitarism brings, and paramilitary behaviour brings within Northern Ireland. And I don't think we need remind people as to what the extent of that harm and the exploitation is. Equally, I think it's important to highlight that the work that is carried out under the Executive Action Plan, that obviously policing plays a very, very key role within that as regards our enforcement activities, but also very clearly it is a whole of society approach that needs to be taken for us to bring the harm that paramilitarism brings to Northern Ireland to an end. So we do need to work as partnerships. As a police service, we have committed, and the Chief Constable has outlined on many occasions, the increase to our neighbourhood officer numbers to ensure and build on that wider community policing within Northern Ireland. And I think that plays a key role. I do want to just give, and again, it's if you can bear with me, it is some figures around the work of the Paramilitary Crime Task Force that was set up in response and following the Fresh Start Agreement. Since its inception, in total, there have been 315 arrests, there have been 711 searches, 250 people have been charged or reported. There are 187 weapons and ammunition have been seized, 57 vehicles, and large numbers are a large amount of money, 4.8 million of revenue loss prevented. So within that, I could give more figures, but I think I use that or take this opportunity to show that as a police service, working through with partners, including the National Crime Agency, including the HMRC, as part of the Paramilitary Crime Task Force, we shall remain absolutely focused on the harm the paramilitaries do, and we shall continue to carry on those investigations.
In fairness, Barbara, it was a direct question about the accuracy of the revelations within the programme, and specifically the existence of the IRA, its structures and its current activities. Okay,
so the programme, to the best of my knowledge, referred to a document which I haven't had sight of what the programme was. We still refer to the 2015 assessment, and if it is the assessment as regards the activities of PARA that you're referring to, the 2015 assessment still remains in place, and that is the current position.
Okay, Dolores, you had a supplementary around this.
The supplementaries in two parts. One in relation to the threats and attacks on journalists. And of course, it wasn't the police's finest hour in relation to the judgment in the Burney and the Caffrey case. I look forward to further debates within the police board with the PSNI in relation to the any review findings. But just broadly then, there does say, I wonder have the police had any engagement with NUJ, which is something I think that people were police had said they would try to rebuild some relationship. And in particular, we have had two female journalists saying that police haven't taken the threats seriously enough against them and their family, particularly those that were posted on social media. The other bit then in relation to the paramilitary activity, and Barbara did talk to the Fresh Start programme and the responsibility for community-wide, but I think there's a broader feeling across many stakeholders that there's been plenty of carrot but not enough stick, and therefore the funding that has been secured going forward under the Fresh Start Agreement for tackling paramilitarism and end criminality, in the view of the police, do you think it's balanced correctly in that is there enough resource going to the enforcement wing, if you like, of that programme?
Shall I come in there, Chair? There's a few bits that maybe in the margins, Dolores, that others can pick up. Firstly, obviously, in relation to the threats against journalists, one is now subject of a complaint against us, so I can probably say least. But there are issues in relation to that case where we've appointed a detective inspector who's made contact with that person, but it wouldn't be fair to say too much about individual cases in a public setting because we never normally go there. I think there has been some dialogue with the National Union of Journalists, but I'm looking to Barbara to check from that meeting on Monday. I'll come back to that. I think in relation to the carrot and stick, Dolores, I think that there is an issue. Obviously, this is one of the things about how we plan for the medium term, because the Paramilitary Crime Task Force is one of a number of discrete funding streams that we have to see each year is going to be sustained. So it does make it difficult to plan. Mark and I are talking increasingly about how the overall approach to organised crime is resourced, how our tactics are fit for purpose. And I talked in my introduction about looking at models of good practice, such as the Matrix team in Merseyside, which is widely regarded as being effective in terms of tackling a similar type of vicious and pernicious organised crime in some parts of the Liverpool City region. So we're here to learn from others, and we'll be having a fresh look at that in the new year. But do you want to talk about the NUJ piece, Barbara?
I haven't engaged with the NUJ this week. I did have the the virtual roundtable with editors this week, but I haven't, and it's something I'll absolutely endeavour to do. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come through now to Liz, a question around spit and bike guards online.
Thanks, Chair. It's obviously in relation to the most recent announcement for the temporary extension of the use of spit and bike guards. So it's just to ask the Chief Constable why an equality and impact assessment wasn't carried out before taking this policy decision to extend. I know they're engaging in an EQIM for further use, but I think it would have helped to address a lot of the concerns that have been raised to date, and why it wasn't discussed with the board before being announced.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Firstly, in relation to the EQIA, we have been since the spring in dialogue with the Equality Commission and trying to follow their public guidance, and particularly, I think, page 3, which was published at the onset of the COVID pandemic. There is sort of views there about all the technicalities of screening as opposed to full assessments. I think, candidly, knowing what we know now, it would have been better to start in March, but we were dealing with a low evidence base because simply the introduction didn't give us the insight about actual effects on people from different communities and different backgrounds as the assessment process would do. So we've now started that process. We had 2 different conversations previously with the Commission, as far as I'm aware, as well as ongoing dialogue about tactics. We're at stage 2 now of the quality impact assessment, so that we will be able to bring that back to the board. At the moment, the timeline looks like May, but if we can scale that down without rushing through meaningful consultation, we're acutely aware that that is an important part of the public confidence question. I think I draw your attention to page 3 of the temporary guidance, because it is about being prospective rather than retrospective in terms of the EQI process. But also in terms of the board, we know it's an important issue, and people have got a variety of views about the effect of this particular tactic. We are an outlier, as I said in my introduction, in terms of anywhere else in the UK now. And we took advice from the chair about how to best present the information, which is why it came through him to members. If there are lessons learned there, clearly on advice again, we can see how we keep the relationship going as we develop the evidence base.
Okay, thank you. Deirdre?
Thank you, Chair. It's again a question on spit and bike guards under your report, Chief Constable. You stated that you reached a different operational conclusion on the basis of legal, medical and professional advice. And considering you mentioned real-time data, can you give me a view on how you ensure that the information across those 3 areas is current, qualitative and independent to inform your opinion and your approach?
Yeah, that's a really broad and deep question there, so I'll try and do my best. And I think it may be something, if with the chair's permission there needs to be more detail, we can either brief personally or by other means, because we have tried really hard at this. Operationally, I think the best thing I can say in terms of real time, Deirdre, is that each week that goes by, we are learning more, simply because we're now at nearly 300 biting incidents and 72 deployments. So each one, there are detailed bits of information recovered, and each one is reviewed by the Ombudsman for any matters of practice or indeed conduct. So that, as I said in my introduction, what we have learned really over the last few months is that the bulk of incidents are in arrest environment. You say that might be predictable, but also a third actually happen on the street. So that limits some of the other opportunities. For example, in a fast-paced situation, I saw some video myself only the other day of somebody that 1 minute was compliant and by a police car, and suddenly, when he was told he was under arrest, became extremely violent and spat in 3 officers' faces before they could really do anything about it. So the level of force and violence that sometimes officers have to face is significant. So there's the operational piece, and there's also the fact that we recognised, as we got that data, that 83% of the times that officers were involved in an incident where they were bitten or spat at was actually involving officers from frontline response teams. We call them LPTs, local policing teams, or neighbourhood officers, whereas we'd actually given the kit in the original rollout, which we had spoken about quite extensively, to other groups. So the COVID crews, as we would call them, the specialist officers do with COVID calls, and armed response officers. So we also took legal advice about our position over the summer, because our own federation was judicially reviewing us about the irrationality of that decision. And we had to take that into account in coming to some of the operational conclusions, because we did have quite forceful advice that we needed to adjust our position. The medical side is, again, it's a really tricky one, because we're dealing with spitting and biting, and often the biting bit that gets forgotten. But we have, for example, through our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Tolhill, has in particular had dialogue with a specialist from the Metropolitan Police who went through this sort of experience over a number of years. So we took into account, for example, a condition experiment, for the best I could say. It wasn't sort of a full replication, but of people wearing a spit guard under stress, and we were seen to take into account the effects of that. He has, through somebody else, been beginning his own, and I do stress this, that it's a small scale study at the moment in terms of the psychological effects of being spat at in particular. That's referenced in some of the detail we can share with you, but it does present concerns about acute stress and sleeplessness for the people that took part in that small scale survey. Broader than that, we've taken into account the opinion of the independent medical panel that advises National Police Chiefs Council, and also we have had a range of dialogue with people that would have concerns. There was a consultation exercise in the summer that was led by Sam Donaldson, which was in fact a precursor to the EQI that Liz was talking about. I've personally spoken to some of the people that would have a particular interest into this, the Ombudsman, the Equality Commissioner as 2 recent examples, but we've reached across a range of people. So you'll see in the letter and the announcement some of the concerns we've tried to assuage. So we are directing officers, once the policy is rolled out, subject to the other checks and balances, that we will not be using spit and bite guards on people that are obviously under the age of 18 or suffering from mental capacity issues or obvious signs of impairment. So to try and directly assuage some of those concerns. We can never say never, because sometimes the difference between a 17 and an 18-year-old is hard to tell, but we are putting that as part of policy. So there are a raft of things, as well as the ongoing and active dialogue that I have personally with the head of the Ombudsman's office, as Mark has with the Chief Executive, looking at feedback from her oversight of the deployments as they come along. So there is quite a rich picture of information we've taken together, as well as the views of our staff associations and trade unions, which also have a legitimate stake here. So I appreciate absolutely, it's a finely balanced decision where I'm looking at human rights. I'm also looking at the need to ensure a safe system of work, both for my officers and staff, but also for people that come into police custody. So we've come to this decision on the best evidence we've got so far. But as I say, I'm committed to working with the board to try and make sure that you're not taken by surprise as this issue evolves over the next few months. And we'll look to the chair to see how best to do that, whether it's through a committee or specific working party, so that we can share the information as we go along.
Okay, thank you. Trevor, you have a supplementary?
Thank you, Chair. I was going to say today, Chief, that I was going to support you in your stance with spit and bite guards up to a point. To be said you're actually going to not use them under 18. I think that's the wrong decision. I think they should be used for anyone. I mean, I think we've all seen some underage people who are very violent. And I think Mike Nesbitt has relayed his concerns today where a person from press was threatened and the police done nothing. But what would the police do with a 17-year-old or a 16-year-old who spat on a member of the public while they were being arrested? How would you deal with that?
Well, I think it's a hypothetical, isn't it? Because we're not saying that in a certain circumstance, it's obviously evident at times when you look at the difference between a 16, 17 or 18-year-old in a violent, fast-paced situation, we're going to be actually looking for proof of date of birth. So that's one of the dilemmas that frontline colleagues face, that you've got to deal with what's in front of you. So it's a policy aspiration. We can't guarantee that it would never happen, but we're trying to listen to concerns based on, for example, things like the rights of the child, which we presume that we don't, but we can't say we never would.
I suppose it's back to that perception. How you've presented this today would give me more concern about actually even considering to not use it in those cases. I actually think that the position you've taken previously, where it's required, it should be used regardless of the age of the individuals. We have all, and many of us have witnessed young people on the kick-off and how violent they actually can be. So I don't think you should actually tie your hands. I think it's the only way you can actually protect all the members of the public.
Yep, I think Mark wants to come in with a quick response.
Yeah, I suppose, Trevor, just to help as well, some of our thinking around this is also based upon some of our guidance around other uses of force, right up to use of AEPs and so forth, where our guidance is that we should try and avoid use on young people and vulnerable persons, because there are other statutory protections that we have to consider in law. For example, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which doesn't apply, obviously, for adults. So I suppose in that sense, Trevor, there's an onus upon the Chief Constable to identify those categories differently. It doesn't mean that force can ever be used, but there is an onus upon us to identify that there are certain categories that we have to address slightly differently, and that particularly includes young people who have different protections under, international law and local law. But practically saying, your example is those are the kind of practical dilemmas that police officers have to face in policing in a human rights environment as well. But there are other considerations that have to be brought into this.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the answers to that, Simon. We'll move on from this area, but just to say, I will write to you asking for clarification. You have provided verbal today on a number of things, but for clarification on a number of fronts after today's meeting. Meryvn, you have queries around ANPR.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks to the Chief for his report, and also can he pass on to his colleagues our appreciation for all that you and your colleagues have done and what has been for us all, particularly for your officers, a very challenging year. And can I also welcome your confirmation that the clock is not being run down in relation to the Bobby Storey funeral COVID breaches. I would ask you to equivocally do the same in assurance that the PSNI will not be bullied into circumnavigating the case sequencing model when it comes to the investigation, or if there is to be an investigation, because I think there's still some uncertainty on the back of your statement earlier on this week in relation to the murder of Pat Finucane, which was a horrendous and terrible crime, and people need to be brought to book. But let's remember that your former Chief Constable of the RUC, the late Sir John Herman, said that Pat Finucane was associated with the IRA, and he used his position as a lawyer to act as a contact between suspects in custody and Republicans on the outside. And let's remember also his brother broke out of the maze, and there's somebody on this board and in this room who also was involved in that activity. And our thoughts are with the James Ferris family, who lost his life as a result of being stabbed and subsequently as a heart attack. But what I want to ensure is that there's no hierarchy of investigations, and that those many hundreds of people who have not got justice are not left on the sidelines again when the focus is brought upon others. The question in relation to the automatic number plate recognition, can I congratulate your organisation on accreditation in relation to that issue? But two things: how does it deal with false number plates? Because those who are involved in illegal activity don't go out in legal cars, they go out with false number plates. And secondly, can this be an effective track and trace for criminals?
Thanks, Meryvn. Firstly, I think it's just a general comment it's worth saying about the whole hierarchy and breadth of issues that fall out of legacy-related crime and investigation. And I think it's just to restate that really how keen we are that this matter is dealt with by other means, whilst I still retain responsibility of investigating crime. There's a matter of public record, what we've said time and again about there should be alternative means of dealing with these issues because they are complex, they are so emotive on all sorts of reasons, and it's an issue that we would prefer to face forwards on rather than having to continue to deal with issues from the past, important as they are. ANPR, thanks for asking the question. It was the work of Andy Freeburn and others that got us accredited in quick time, so I'm glad you appreciate that. I think, if you may, Meryvn or Chair, I'd prefer to answer the specifics of some of that, not so much in public, because as you say, criminals will adapt their tactics. We have invested recently in the new Intercept team, which you'll see popping up on social media, and I think they've got off to a really good start. There are two separate issues about false plates, as in completely made up and clone plates, which is one that looks like one that's legitimate. So I prefer, if I can, Chair, just to talk about that in private.
Barbara, you wanted to come in?
Thank you, Chair. It was merely a point of clarification. I know I'm bringing us back slightly, but thank you for your forbearance. It was as regards engagement with the editors, and the member had asked me around that. It's just to clarify that it was editors whose journalists had been subject of threats specifically that I had engaged with. So it was just in case that comment had appeared misleading in any aspects. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Jerry, you wanted a supplementary on it?
I was going to come in, but after what Meryvn Storey said, I think it's an absolute disgrace that he should say in a public forum like this, that he should first of all say that it was a terrible murder and then attempt to blacken the name of Pat Finucane, who was a human rights lawyer, and that he should apologise to the family. He has often talked about victims here, and yet he has had no such view, no such sensitivity when it comes to the Finucane family, and he is adding to their distress by saying what he said, and he is only saying it because a person who has passed away cannot be defamed in law or labelled, and it's I'm astounded that he would say that in a forum like this, and I would bring it back, and I'll finish with this, to a British minister who shortly before Pat Finucane was murdered said similar things, and that is connected into his death, setting the model for it. I mean, it's a disgrace.
Dolores, you wanted to come back on that?
Well, yes, Chair, I do think Meryvn should reflect on what he's saying. I mean, the whole situation has been very badly handled, to say the very least, by a British Secretary of State who, in our opinion, isn't fit for office. And we saw what he did yesterday to the WAVE organisation, which, as you know, represents many victims right across the spectrum of people who were injured or who had family murdered in a conflict. And he disingenuously and deliberately misrepresented them only yesterday in relation to his failure to consult and to engage with victims in terms of dealing with the legacy of the past. And we all want to see this dealt with in a moral, ethical and comprehensive way. And we know that this is a poison chalice that has remained with the police for far, far too long. But I really do object to Meryvn's comments. We want to see all victims to get the truth and justice that they campaign for and that which they deserve. And we regret the fact, very much so, that the police have been brought in once again by the Secretary of State into the Finucane inquiry and the failure of the British government to uphold its international agreements and obligations as the Supreme Court judgment reflected on. We think the Secretary of State has behaved woefully far short of anyone in public life in any level of integrity in relation to victims of the conflict.
Okay, thank you. We've covered that subject. If we could get back now to questions to the Chief Constable, where we can on policing. I accept the feelings that exist around all of that. John Blair, Diversity and Community Relations Task Force.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Before I come to that, can I associate myself with the condemnation expressed today of threats against local journalists? I'm pleased that the senior policing team are engaged on the matter, and hopefully all of us can do what we can collectively to protect freedom of the press, and also the freedom of speech that we enjoy. Separately, Chair, I welcome the intention of the Chief Constable to establish a community relations task force to address the needs and concerns of the many diverse communities in Northern Ireland. And I ask, though, to the Chief Constable how he can reassure us that the task force in itself will be representative of society in Northern Ireland and will reflect in its membership the diversity in those communities across Northern Ireland.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, to echo your comments, I think it's important that we do state quite publicly that some of this threat and intimidation of a journalist and civil society is reprehensible, and we will do all we can to tackle it. The task force, well, there's two bits here actually. Absolutely, it'd be a bit of an embarrassment if it wasn't representative, because that's the whole purpose of trying to get better insight. The first thing I think, John, is through the chair, we want to work with the board to help set the terms of reference, to make sure that we use our best experience to see how we go about that, and that all views and opinions as best they can be reflected. I'd see this is very much sort of a framework at the moment, but obviously there has to be some policing perspective, either people with specialist experience, people from the neighbourhood teams. We're looking at working with academia, specific interest groups, the community themselves. We're looking to see how we have a panel of critical friends, and also our own staff associations and networks who can bring experience from a variety of different backgrounds too. So we've got quite a rich picture of different perspectives to try and make sure this is really meaningful. But we are literally at the footsteps of this and want a conversation with people about how to make best use of the opportunity actually to build upon the past, but make sure that community engagement is as meaningful and rounded as it can be, because it links so strongly with the investment in neighbourhood policing. So any ideas are welcome.
Thank you. Edgar has a question which relates to the first part of what John said around the threats to journalists, but it's wider than just that.
Thanks, Chair. The review of hate crime legislation published earlier this week was very comprehensive, but it drew particular attention to the significance of social media platforms in promoting offensive and threatening material. We've talked about it in relation to journalists, but it's also in terms of public representatives. What influence or leverage does the PSNI have currently in terms of requiring the removal of offensive material? And are you conscious of any specific deficiencies in the existing legislation?
Yeah, I think that Mark says, because of his background on hate crime, will probably want to come in, I'd imagine. But I think in the general thing, it is worth stating that we have obviously welcomed and received the review. We contributed to it. Mark McKeown is on the call today, is going to be our lead for taking together the response and seeing how we deal with the recommendations, and inevitably we'll bring back further information either to here or committee. But do you want to come in on the detail, Mark?
If I could just make a broad comment, I mean, Mark might want to talk about Judge Martin's report, but I'm having a lot of conversation nationally about this at the minute, actually, because the Law Commission report into hate crime across other parts of GB has come to similar conclusions. Also talking to Sarah Khan, the Extremism Commissioner, she's also raised with me a number of issues about online hate. And what we have also seen is particularly not just about interest groups, but particularly offensive material directed towards women in public life. It's very prevalent. Sure. The reality is that takedowns are solely the responsibility of the internet providers. We don't have the law to take the stuff down, so it's taken down by them if they agree that it breaches their codes of conduct. There are piecemeal approaches across all police services, and we have a small hub in the UK, very small hub in the UK who interface with Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and other agencies. But ultimately, it's a matter for them. And you'll see this in the press around other things more globally, where there's contested space around Facebook, whatever, and Facebook take their own position. Without saying an awful lot more, we are thinking about how we can have a more coordinated response, but it still remains a pretty open landscape. You can pretty much say what you want, and then it's a question of having it taken down afterwards. There are obviously steps that the internet providers can take to bar certain people or certain identities, but then people circumvent those with new phone numbers and new identities and so forth. It is a pernicious, extremely difficult problem, Edgar. One interesting thing about it as well, just to mention, that it tends to fall into two categories. We do see organised trolling, and certainly even recently saw a report about, from the far right, about how the far right use this type of activity to sort of inculcate young members. But also we have a lot of people who just do this as single entities, and whenever they're confronted by it, have just sort of limited explanations for it. Just do it because they can. So I don't know if Mark wants to make additional comment about Judge Martin's report, but we are having to work sort of nationally to see if we can get anything more comprehensive done on this.
Thank you. Joanne, back on line. I've lost her now.
I'm here.
Oh, you're there. Sorry, there's so many on screen, I can't keep up. Yeah, Joanne, sorry, you've got a question around COVID consistency and PCT.
I do, Chairman. Thank you very much. Firstly, I'd just like to say that I've recently met with victims and with family members of those killed in the Shangle Bowl. And for the record, that I stand with those people, and people of Lamont, Darkley, and T-Ban, and all the other innocent victims, too numerous to mention, who haven't had inquiries, refused, and hundreds of millions of pounds spent on their fight for justice. So I'll move on to the Chief Constable's report. Firstly, I'd like to say, Chief, I'm very grateful that you've included modern slavery in your report. It's a welcome addition to the report. I have questions on that, but I think given the time pressures, I'll drop you those in writing. My first question is with regard to the PCTF. You've had excellent success this past 3 months, and it's great to see the statistics that you've provided for us, but I would be keen to know your assessment of the impact that that will have on those organisations. And then I want to move to the consistency of application with regard to police and COVID, and a little compare and contrast, whereby in my constituency, I had a constituent who celebrated her husband's 30th birthday with her husband, his parents, and 2 friends. And the police promptly arrived at the door, and all 6 were furnished with £200 fines. Contrast that to the Holy Lands, where there is massive disorder in the street. And as far as I understand, there were 2 arrests and 9 COVID fines. I have received a complaint that I forwarded to you from a constituent who saw numerous police vehicles and police in riot gear and with gas masks on, or that type of facial wear, with a small number of people gathered at City Hall to protest the regulations. And then that is contrasted whereby a much larger crowd was gathered in Corn Market to enjoy a buskers performance. Then we moved to the Bobby Storey investigation, and we're 5 months on from that. And I note your comment at the start of the meeting, Chief Constable, but we're 5 months on, and there is a real risk, because we're 3 weeks from Christmas, that criminal proceedings will not commence because the offences may well become statute barred. Given that the individual sought for interview were afforded the luxury of 8 weeks to respond to the investigation and give their consent, I really do think that we need some action on this, and we need to see more than reassurances that the chief isn't, the police and whoever else involved aren't running down the clock because of the personalities and the politics involved. I'm grateful that the chief has accepted that all of this approach and the inconsistencies therein is garnering frustration of the community, is actually reinforcing the view that there is 2-tier policing for some, and some are more equal than others, and the view that the police only police the easy option. I mean, this is a very serious issue within communities in the land, that the police only deal with the people who are easy to police because they don't want to get into a disorder situation, but it can't be the way. So I'd like to know what action is going to be taken to try and address these issues, because I'll tell you this, Chief Constable, the people who have abided by the regulations with regard to the burial of their loved ones are watching how this plays out. And public cooperation is at risk here because of how people see these regulations are being policed. And on the one hand, it's stringent, and on the other hand, well, it's a wee bit difficult. So we'll just leave it.
Simon?
Okay, there's an awful lot there, Joanne, so I'll try as best I can to navigate some of it. I might bring Alan in just around the consistency question, because you've probably got some examples you can bring about what we wrestle with on a daily basis. If I start with your last comments on the Storey investigation, now clearly without sounding like a well-stuck record, it is a live investigation still, but suffice to say that I'm satisfied that we have taken the steps using due process to make sure that it doesn't go statute barred. And there's a form that gets filled in that allows us to do that with the PPS, but jurisprudence would say that you don't do it yet. So we're in the hands of both our own investigators and the PPS. Time will tell about what has gone on and why, but we also have to respect due process and the right to take legal advice. So I think that's about as much as I can say at the moment. We are conscious it's a legitimate public concern, and as soon as we can say more, we will do. Consistency is one of the issues I've touched on the report, Joanne, and it is just so difficult when you look at trying to be consistent in consistent situations, either by time, place, dynamics of the situation, the type of crowd or others you're facing. So to try and say there's always going to be a one-size-fits-all approach is difficult. I remind you, we have the 4Es approach specifically for that reason, because I think it was at last month's board we said that one of the issues I and the top team are certainly conscious of is that long-term public cooperation and community relations will be affected potentially by how people see how well we've dealt with police in the COVID crisis in terms of cooperation, relationships and fairness. So it's not to take that lightly, but I'll bring Alan in a minute if I can, because he can probably explain to you some of the things we try and do through our coordination centre to make sure that tactics meet the problem. In terms of the PCTF, well, we have upped our game, frankly, in the last few months, if that's one way of looking at it, in terms of outputs. We are sometimes in the hands of the criminal justice system, because I think that's one of the biggest sanctions that people will see. It's not just arrest, but it's prosecution and a consequence for criminal behaviour. Barbara touched upon about the community reaction, and I think that's also hugely important. So the impact is not just about taking a car, seizing cash, going to prison, but it's actually communities themselves turning these people around and turning them out, because there's no place for it in a modern society. But we have to be realistic. We can't arrest everybody at once. We have to target resources where the evidence takes us, but we're alive to the fact that we're constantly being asked questions about can we do more. But I can bring Barbara in a minute to give some specifics of recent activity to give you some reassurance. But also, should we turn to Alan about the consistency question, because he can give you some facts and figures.
Over to you, Alan.
Thanks, Chair. We have a 24/7 cell that runs led by an inspector and a team. It's the same team from the same group of people for consistency, and have been running largely throughout the COVID crisis. And the vast majority of decisions around issuing penalties are approved to that centre, and their job to run a route across that, to make sure that we have applied the 4Es as outlined, to consider all the circumstances, consider the ever-changing regulations, frankly, look at circumstances in the round and decide whether the proposal of the officer to issue a penalty is fair and appropriate. All of that is guided by the 4Es, which is the National Police Chiefs Council outlined approach, which has been updated more recently in line with national policy, where it says that whilst we live up to 4Es, those people who recklessly ignore the regulations should expect to receive a penalty notice. That's the national position across UK policing, and the one we subscribe to. If somebody has been if police have attended a house party, Joanne, then that will have been as a result of reporting them to the public, but we generally don't go door to door, obviously you would understand. So it has been in response to reports raised by members of the public. The limitations around house parties is clear in the regulations. You're allowed to have your own household party bubble outside of that, and then you run the risk of being agreed to the regulations that have been set by the officers at the thing. Comparing that to Holy Lands continues to be above where it was when universities are back. With a significant amount of work done between ourselves, but the council and universities to bring that under control. It has raised in its numbers in the last number of weeks ago. I can absolutely assure you, as of this morning, we are in excess of 800 fixed penalty notices for up £200 level. The large majority of those are house parties, and a significant portion, if not a majority of those, are being issued in that same area that you speak about. So we believe that the policing response in that area to the need for public facing absolutely proportionate and reflected in the details that were given. In terms of city centre one, the protest that was outside the city centre, it's not the first of its type, and it's not the first time people involved have organised such a protest in pre-planned and premeditated breaching of health protection regulations. That's a factor in our decision making. It was premeditated, it was pre-organised, it was done in full knowledge of the breach of regulations, and a number of people ended up arrested because it got police in execution of duties in relation to that. But of course, we have seen, and I doubt and I fear we will see in the run into Christmas, as shops and businesses reopen and get their lives back on track, we'll also see larger crowds in towns and shopping centres and city centres, and that will be a challenge for the health authorities, the ambassadors for local councils, and indeed police officers. But by and large, that doesn't happen in a pre-planned and premeditated manner. And by and large, when you apply the three, so people do move on to words associated as requested, and therefore you don't end up in a split situation. And as the chief has said, we have a consistent approach, but some situations do differ, and therefore you get different outcomes. And I would contend that it's not because we approach them differently, just because that is dependent on whether people hear the regulations when requested to do so, or choose not to, and whether they choose not to, then regrettably enforcement does follow. That's not our preference. We'd rather people comply without it, and regrettably that's not always the case.
Thank you. Barbara, did you want to come in?
Yeah, it might be a final word, Chair. I believe truly the paramilitaries are feeling the pressure, they should feel the pressure, and they will feel the pressure of every law enforcement investigative option that we have.
Thank you. Joanne?
I thank all three officers for their answers. I suppose the one thing that I would like to reiterate is at the point at which members of the public who are walking past and see these operations and decide to take action and write to their MLAs and their MP in this case as well, I think that goes some way to showing that there is an issue with regard to how people perceive the inconsistency, and whether the police think it's consistent or not. There's an issue with how the public view it that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Trevor, sorry, not Trevor. Firstly, Tom Buchanan. Tom, you have a question around drugs, I believe.
Thank you. And again, just on the last point that Joanne raised, I have to agree with Joanne on the fact that the perception from the public out there is that there is a two-tier policing system when it comes to the way COVID has been policed. So I think that that's something that you've got to take seriously. You've got to look at and seek to address that particular issue, because that perception is not going to go away unless the public can see for themselves that what they perceive as a two-tier policing isn't there. But to come back to the other, I first of all want to commend you on the discovery and the dismantling of the drug factory that was found in Cookstown. And I suppose that raises issues as to whether or not this is a normal trend, or whether it's something that's increasing within the rural areas. And added to that, I suppose, is the concern of the report from the National Crime Agency's strategic assessment of serious crime, which found that all common drugs associated with drugs-related deaths have increased by 39% in Northern Ireland. That's 20% more than the UK average. And I suppose my question is, are you satisfied that the local policing activity that's disrupting these gangs and groups that profit from these illegal activities, that they are sufficiently resourced in order to meet the increasing demand, if you like, that's placed on the officers at this particular time?
Thanks, Tom. A few bits there. Firstly, in relation to drug-related deaths, it cast my mind back actually to a conversation we had here some time ago with the previous chair, actually, where we publicly appeal for more support in tackling the issue of the higher related to drug-related deaths in Northern Ireland, because clearly policing is only affecting one part of this problem, which is the supply chain, and obviously there are a whole raft of issues around what causes the person to feel the need to use drugs in the first place, and that is well rehearsed. So I think notwithstanding the current debate about COVID and pressures on the health service, there is a key partner here that we want to work with more closely to try and do more to prevent this in the first place, as well as other people that would have a place at the table. And that's something I'm trying to think back. We might have been just before your time where we had that debate in here. In relation to drugs activity, it will operate at different tiers and different levels. So that quick time information sometimes would go to a district support team or a neighbourhood team to get a warrant and search the premises. Sometimes it's more longer term and sophisticated operations, if I could describe it like that. But largely, it'll be teams through Barbara's command will undertake. We touched upon the report that so far this is proving to be a record year for seizures in terms of sheer volumes and amounts, in terms of the actual what they represent in cash terms. But probably you can never do enough of this because it's a pervasive societal problem. And the reality is we have resources we have to prioritise. I take you back before to the scale of investigation that we've got detectives working on at the moment, 100 homicides, 120 terrorism-related investigations. They're all part of where we've got to make choices about we put time, effort and energy. And similarly, we recognise that one of the enduring concerns of the public is doing more about dealing with drug misuse and drug dealing in communities right across Northern Ireland. So this is a really difficult issue for us. Barbara runs a process where we assess opportunities around intelligence, available resource. It's not just about detectives, it's about the tactical support group and others supporting searches and arrest operations, so that it's a whole sort of organisation endeavour to get this right. I'm conscious of time, Chair, so whether Barbara's best briefing Tom at the end of the meeting, or you want a bit more detail of some of the things we do.
Yeah, okay, yeah, so if Barbara can answer Tom's questions at the end, that would be great. Okay. Thank you. Just finally, last few questions now. I'm checking, Dolores, did you have a question on child abuse that you wanted to raise or not?
Well, Chair, it was really just with the debates around education and schools opening and closing and the nature of that abuse and the dark web in terms of the concerns the NCA and the police have had and their findings. I just wondered what in terms of the investigations, what the findings are so far. I mean, I know that some organisations, including the Education Authority, had, and then SPCA and Meryvn and others, sought to inform parents and to put apps or whatever protections onto the children's access points. But I just wonder around the time, is there a set time during the day? Has it grown during lockdown? Is there a difference between when the children are locked down or when the schools are open and closed in terms of the volume of attacks? And I noticed something around Zooming, and I wasn't quite sure what that was and how we all can be on our guard better about that in relation to protecting young people.
I just think that's quite an enormous issue there, Dolores, in terms of different types of crime and risk. And it may be something that lends itself better to a written report, because we're talking about a whole raft of different issues there, if I can.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm happy to accept it in written form. And then Trevor, finally, I think
I have three questions here, maybe, but the first one, Chief, I think was alluded to about the court case that made media attention, and clearly this board was very divided on it, and it wasn't a unanimous decision that was arrived at. And one of those reasons would have been obviously that we wanted transparency and openness. And I actually think the very fact on how the court case has been portrayed in the media, maybe the media was inaccurate, but it did go on to discuss in that case that it was in reference to the destruction of the transparency piece that my colleagues and myself were in favour of. That's the first question. The second one is the uniform consultation process. And I don't think at this stage that we should get into the dispute whether it's a good uniform or otherwise. I mean, I think we've listened to and maybe feel that some of that from some of the officers who have to wear it. And I think that's important that they get their say, because bearing in mind they have to use the uniform. And I'm sure many have campaigned that the current uniform has been unsuitable on many occasions. And I concur with that. But that said, I suppose the consultation process has been started. And we all know that I'm sure we were aware you would have a very good the consultation process actually on the PSNI website this week. Was that an oversight, or is there success? And the last one then is, and I suppose I'm leaving them last because I suppose there's a perception they feel they're always last, and that's the civilians within the police force. I'm being told that some of them are still waiting on, and I don't know if this is accurate or inaccurate, but you can correct it, that their 2019 pay award, many are saying that that hasn't been settled, and many of them are actually, I suppose, like most families, are in need of that, and we're now coming to Christmas 20, so that's 19, and I suppose following on from that then will be the 20 pay award as well.
If I can, Chair, you asked me 3 questions. Can I give you 2 answers and ask Mark to do another one? Certainly, the pay award, I agree, it's a constant frustration, the delay, so that is accurate. We're still waiting for news on the pay award from last year. It would be good to get it in the pay package before Christmas, but I think from memory, the clock is at the end. We do have dialogue with the civil service about the speed in which it takes to get these predictable awards through the system, because we've got parity with the UK. So we know what's coming, and it's whether it's police staff who obviously are an integral part of the workforce, and the police officers were constantly behind the curve. So all we can do is keep pressing, and if anyone else wants to join us in that endeavour, I'm sure it'd be appreciated. I'm glad you've asked the question about the uniform, because it's certainly to frontline colleagues, it's probably the single issue when I go out on patrol that I get asked about the most. There is a frustration, I think it's fair to say, with the current provision of uniform for frontline officers. The feedback that so far looks like, Trevor, is that from the staff themselves, overwhelmingly pleased with it in terms of its style, quality, and how it's fit for purpose. I'll just check what was on the website. I don't actually know. I do notice there was a survey yesterday on social media. Whether it hit the website as well, I don't know. You might mean the intranet. Yeah.
Sorry, Twitter, maybe I think it was actually it was referenced that it wasn't your Twitter accounts,
yeah,
which is a good form.
Yeah, it was on social media accounts yesterday. I nearly filled it in myself, and then thought I'd be accused of cheating if I expressed a view. So that's been run twice from memory now on social media accounts. There is the PCSP consultation process, which we've talked about as well. Each officer that's wearing the uniform will be asked a view at the end of it. And then, if you're meaning, is there an intranet as opposed to a website process? I'll have to have a look at that so we get feedback from.
All social media.
Yeah. Yeah, it is, as far as I'm aware, but I'll check. It's going out on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook to expose what we're doing and also seek feedback. But I can get back to you on that. And I think Mark's probably got the detail on the question.
Well, I'm not aware of the specifics of the press report, and Trevor, but my understanding is that the mediation process that was engaged dealt with both the compensatory factors the board discussed, and also, as was briefed, then there was extant issues around material and deletion material. My understanding is that matter is now entirely closed. All of it. The matter is now finished, and certainly the bit that I picked up was the comment of the Lord Chief Justice, sort of thanking parties for arriving at a conclusion. And using, I think, the mediation process, which is a newer process, but unless I'm proven to be wrong, Trevor, my understanding is that all matters have been dealt with and it's now closed.
Okay, thank you. I just checked, we are well over time, but I want to draw to a conclusion. I don't wish to cut out anybody who has a burning question, so if there are any, you can speak now. Otherwise, I really do appreciate you sticking with us. Thank you for the answers that were given, and I think it's more important that we cover the questions than that we hit the timeline. At least that's my excuse as chair for not having hit the timeline. Thank you to the Chief Constable and indeed to the Director General who's now gone on to other matters. On behalf of the board, I can place on record my thanks to you and all of your officers and staff for the work and efforts, particularly given the additional challenges this year from policing in the pandemic, and we do recognise how difficult that has been. Our next accountability session will be in 2021, which hopefully will see some return to normality, and I can't wait to, all these lovely people in Zoom staring straight at me is a great thing. I can't wait to have you all back in the room and not try to balance the bit between the room and the Zoom. But the next session is next year, and until then, I wish you all a very happy and peaceful, hopefully, Christmas. And thank you very much for sticking with us through this year. Thank you. thank you to those online who've joined us.
And to you, Chair.
Happy Christmas.
Happy Christmas. Merry Christmas.